Ums and ahs are quite often thought of as errors that you want to get rid of. They're very commonly littered through our talk, and it's quite difficult to totally erase them. But what they're doing is quite specific things. So sometimes they're doing, I'm thinking, I'm searching for a word. Sometimes they are showing difficulty in putting this thing together. They're showing an orientation to delicacy. They're doing lots of different things in talk.
What's your problem with asking people, how are you?
I have a problem with people how they are, but it is a very interesting thing to examine as it unfolds in real conversations in real time in different settings.
Why?
So, hi, how are you? Fine, how are you? Is a really common way in which conversations start. It's a kind of no problem, very mundane, routine way in which conversations typically start between people who know each other fairly well. And those how are yous can sound like they're just filler talk, that they're not really doing anything very much, that people kind of lie in response. They say, fine, how are you? Not, my life is horrendous. They don't do it at that point in the conversation. And so the fact is, when you see loads of those conversations starting in that way, it can just look like nothing special is happening. But once you start to contrast those with other kinds of conversations and the very start of them, you can start to see that apparently pointless filler talk is actually telling you a lot about the kind of interaction that's about to happen. So, for example, how do you convey, I'm in a rush, something's an emergency? You stop people doing those how are yous and you say immediately, I just need to check, did you leave the oven on? I've got some nice examples where people immediately start a conversation, not with hi, how are you, but Chris, Liz, what's the deal? And you can immediately see, hey, there's no how are yous. They're about to have a huge argument. And then I've got an amazing example where a woman calls 999. And in order to convey to the dispatcher, somehow my life is in danger, but I need you to hear that I'm talking to her. I need the person who might be actually threatening my life in the house to sort of hear, oh, they're talking to a friend. Then you do those how are yous, and you hope that the person on the other end of the phone kind of catches on, which they do pretty quickly, to, oh, this person is pretending to have a conversation with a friend by doing that thing that always happens at the start of a call, which is quite amazing to see.
Most calls that go to 999 are not somebody asking how are you and taking their time with stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So I've got some amazing data in which people are phoning up, having to convey to the person that they're talking to, I'm in danger, but they can't use those words because the person or the situation that they are in danger from is there as well. So how does that happen without using any of the words? People say things like, I'd like to order a pizza for delivery. How does the call taker hear that as a genuine request for help, especially since actually one of the tasks that the police call takers have to do is figure out from all of the potential nuisance calls that they actually do get that do sound a bit like that. How do you figure that out? But they can figure it out pretty quickly.
What is a better question to ask somebody than hi, how are you?
It depends what you want to do. So this it's not that it's a bad question. It's just that if it's there at the start of a conversation, then probably it means that there's nothing urgent, nothing pressing, no conflict about to happen. It can also be exploited by people. So I've also studied cold call sales, where you can see people saying things like, "Hi, how are you?" And because generally we can recognize someone's voice when they do that kind of thing. If you don't recognize the voice, you're immediately on your guard because you're like, I don't recognize the voice even from the start of this conversation. And so then what happens is that you don't get fine, how are you? You might get fine and then nothing. And if a salesperson's any good, they're hearing, oh, this person doesn't want to do small talk with me, and they just cut to the chase. Whereas I've got some really cringeworthy calls where people still say, oh, and how's the weather? And you're like, this person's going, listen to me, I don't really want to have this conversation with you. So the presence or not of how are yous are just very interesting at the start. Right from the opening sort of few seconds of a conversation, you can tell a lot.
Have you ever looked at those pre-recorded sales calls where it's, hi, how are you? Silence. Yes,
I haven't.
in today. And that sort of, they've obviously tried to create a single-sided conversation with sufficient breaks in between as to hook someone in. I can't believe that that's ever worked.
I can't believe it either, because people are really quick at figuring out that this isn't a human voice at the right pace, at the right pitch. even voices that are generated through some kind of algorithm, or they're just or actors are used to kind of put into some kind of chatbot, you can tell pretty quickly. I don't know if there's a really nice case called Lenny the chatbot, and Lenny the chatbot was developed by somebody who basically wanted to stop or just trap cold callers to his home on a loop of their own kind of making. So someone would phone the house and Lenny the chatbot would answer. And Lenny the chatbot didn't have any kind of algorithms or anything. It was just something like 16 phrases pre-recorded and then shuffled. And it sounded like the voice of an elderly Australian man. And so the cold caller, did think that they were talking to an elderly Australian man, and they tried to make sense of what this guy was saying to them. And so, how long could Lenny the chatbot keep someone in a conversation? So that was very nice, and people can go, and there's endless recordings on YouTube. You can go and see how Lenny manages to keep people on the line, and people are trying to get out, but they're like, oh, I can't really leave him now because he sounds just like this old gentleman. And yeah.
It seems like there's a particular satisfaction on the internet for watching scammers. Not saying that cold calling is the same as scamming, but some people put it into a similar bucket. There's entire YouTube channels dedicated to really sophisticated computer white hat hackers that reverse the scammer cold calls, and they tell them stuff like, I know the address of the building that they're calling from, where they are, and they sometimes do other stuff to them, play around with their computer. So it doesn't surprise me that Lenny the chatbot he's like the nerfed version. He's like the kiddies version of that. So given the fact that you do conversational analysis for a living, just how much are humans pushed and pulled around by language?
A lot, which makes it sound bad in a way, like we're kind of manipulating each other all the time. But everything gets done really through interaction. Even if we're not just talking about words, we're talking about gestures and gaze and all the embodied things that go along with words. And it's the thing that kind of drives everything. We ask, we invite, we offer, we get help. We do a lot of things in everyday social life and our workplace lives through social interaction, and without being aware sometimes, but also of course sometimes really being aware. If you have that bristly feeling that someone's doing something that you're finding difficult but you can't pin it down, sometimes they're the kinds of things that for me as a conversation analyst I can transcribe and try to unpack what it feels like when you're really pushing for service, when you, like, for example, I've studied people calling their GP receptions, and what does it feel like when somehow you're not being offered things that is probably the person's job to offer you that thing? What does, and if we all feel that sense of like, God, I feel like a burden. I feel like I'm really pushing you to give me some service, and you can sort of start to unpack that. So a really nice example is going into a cafe, getting your coffee or your tea, and saying, do you have Wi-Fi? Yes, we do. So can customers use it? Yes, they can. This is real. This is a field note sort of scribbled down hastily after going into a cafe. And then eventually the cafe, very sort of, cool cafe staff owner just sort of points at the code, which is painted in this very arty hipster way, right at that's like 12 foot high on the wall, and you get the code. And so you really feel like, God, I really had to drag that out of you, as though somehow you didn't understand that you have Wi-Fi wasn't a request for the code, as well as it's not just a yes no question. Whereas the much nicer experience, which is also real, also scribbled down as a field note, was going into a cafe. As your tea comes across the desk, the cafe staff member says, oh, by the way, if you need the Wi-Fi, here's the code. And what's so nice about that is you feel really great about that person, the cafe, and it didn't involve things like, hey, what's your name? It didn't involve all of those more scripted sounding things that seem to have found their way into some types of service encounter. It's actually about, maybe you need this thing and here it is. You don't even have to ask for it.
It's cutting off at the knees as well, the amount of back and forth that's needed between the person that's serving, presuming that they need to be efficient and not waste their time having a 5-minute conversation about the Wi-Fi code. Just presuming that, look, if you need the code, it's 12 feet on the wall, painted on a piece of driftwood or whatever. That helps. Another thing as well I've noticed, it seems like brevity, or at least appreciating people's time, especially in the modern world, because everyone's so distracted by their devices that their time to actually do the things that they need to do now has become completely condensed down.
Yeah.
I think that just trying to do things in the minimum amount of time. For instance, if you're doing outreach to people, my advice has always been that the message should be readable within the space of about 20 seconds, especially if the person that you're trying to reach out to is someone that's of high repute, right? Mm-hmm. Like they are very, very busy. And if you send them a huge essay that they've got to go through, I think that your chances tend to decrease. And that's kind of the same for even my mum. My mum's a perfectly pleasant person, but she doesn't want to spend forever talking to the checkout cashier at the local shop.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the cafe example that I just gave is a nice example of how quickly you can make someone feel a bit warm towards you whilst getting potential needs met, but it's very, very short and very, very efficient. I've also done some work when people are phoning the vet. So this is a nice example of actually listening for what people want in this moment as well, and whether or not you're able to do that. So case one, someone phones up and says, how much does it cost to get injections done from a new puppy? And the vet receptionist, trying to build rapport, or I don't know, just sound lovely on the phone, is like, oh, what's your puppy called? And there's this little delay. And in my world, delays of like 0.7 seconds is quite large. And you might get Victor. Now, that's someone who doesn't want to have a long conversation about the new puppy. But the call taker isn't really, she's just going for it. And you're like, oh, and is it your first puppy? Yeah. It's like, you should be able to hear by now, they just want the price. And in fact, in this particular call, it's almost like the sort of Star Wars credit that this sales, well, it's not even a salesperson, the receptionist goes on and on and on, what we can do for you is, and in the end, it's, it's going nowhere. Whereas actually, maybe at that point where you say, oh, what's your puppy called? And the person's like, oh, well, some people are dying to talk about their new puppy. So can you be nimble enough and listen enough to actually think, right, this is someone to do that with because they're dying to do it. This is someone who just wants the information.
It's interesting thinking about the fact that people's words are one of the most direct insights that we have into their nature as a person. So yeah, actions are important or whatever, like someone saying, I hope the funeral was good, whilst not being there isn't quite the same. But someone's words and the way that they put them across to you when we're talking about someone and saying that they're rude or abrupt or nice or kind or caring or whatever, that forms a massive amount of our interpretation of that person and their personality overall. Yeah,
absolutely. So I have this thing, it's not a serious thing, I should say, but called like the conversation analytic personality diagnostic, which is not a serious personality tool. But the point is that when you're in an interaction, a conversation with somebody, you don't sort of give them a questionnaire, check what kind of personality they are on some scale, if you believe in that kind of thing. And then on the basis of what they score, they're an extrovert, an introvert, whatever they are, you then take the next turn. You have to be much faster than that all the time. And so exactly that, you're kind of, on what basis would you say someone is rude or they seem warm or they were it's basically what they do. And of course, a lot of what you do is what you say. So we do have this sense of, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk, and actions speak louder than words. But in my world, again, a lot of what we do is what we say. They're the same sorts of things. So what is being offensive? A lot of the time, it's not, you don't do being offensive by punching somebody. I mean, that would be offensive, but you be offensive through your words. So what you do is basically what a lot of people are using almost all the time to decide what kind of person you are.
I like that reversal of the age-old wisdom of it's not about what you say, it's about what you do. But yeah, you're right. For the most part, people aren't doing things, they're saying things. And if the broadest area under the curve is people just talking about stuff, making sure that you talk about things in an appropriate manner to get the kind of response that you're looking for and to have the sort of impact that you hope for is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So how do you, for example, I've got this one of my categories is the idea of the first mover. So parents can often be first movers, and by that I just mean that they take a problematic first turn, and then you can get trapped immediately in a conflict. So things like, oh, I don't really like that jumper. It's like, wow, if I said that to you, mum, dad, you'd be like, oh, I'm so offended, and if you call them out on it, they're like, oh, I was just joking. So people can be quite challenging in their opening gambits, and then somehow if you call them out on it, you're the problem by being offended rather than the person actually being offensive in the first instance. So again, lots of examples of that in email as well. People will write you an email that somehow is, you immediately feel annoyed, but you can't say anything because, strangely enough, the sort of constraints around the way we interact with each other mean that it's actually quite hard to just maybe be as direct back. You have to we let a lot of things slide, don't we? All because otherwise you'd just be angry all the time.
Is there something about that? Is there something about the convention that when somebody sort of is that first mover and maybe decides to take a left turn out of the conversation to say something that's got a bit of snidey topspin, there is something that when you break the fourth wall and you go, hang on a second, that's a bit unfair, isn't it? And especially if you do it in a group and there's other people listening as well, it's like the record needle scratching and everyone's like, ah, in a way that the first mover being a dick didn't. That's so strange.
Yeah. I mean, some people's entitlement to take that first turn on the basis that quite often people won't challenge them on it, because it's difficult to. It's really difficult to. So everything from, so again, going back to the patients calling their doctors, those kinds of conversations, right? Sometimes at the end of those conversations, they end in a very orderly way. So in that, hi, how are you? Fine, how are you? The ends of conversations, when somebody is calling up as a service user, the service provider provides the service, and then the service user, it's up to the service user to kind of say, right, this is over. And they say thanks or thanks very much. And then the service provider will say thanks and then bye bye. So it goes thanks, bye, bye. Really, really, really commonly. Now, in my lots of analysis of all of these patients calling their GPs, occasionally what will happen is that the service provider, the receptionist, will have, said something or other and said, your prescription will be here. And then they'll say, thanks. And they are trying to end the call, but it's not really their place to go first. And what happens very typically after that is then the patient has to sort of jump back into the conversation and say, but so who am I seeing? So when? And so you've got the burden on the patient to get maybe the confirmation that they were after, but also push past the receptionist trying to end the call. And basically what you see in those moments is just the painfulness of withholding a thank you. So the next time you're unhappy on a telephone call, try not saying thank you at the end. Try to not say thank you first. And then when the receptionist or the service provider says thanks to end the call, try not saying thank you. You'll feel really horrible. So from that sense of like, it's very difficult to just not say thank you at the end of a call, all the way through to how do you be an ally? How do you speak up if someone is being sexist, racist, whatever the ism, prejudice might be? And one of the interesting things, again, I've done a lot of work on what counts as an ism, which is different for different people. And then what do you do in response? And of course, people will say what they would say in response to somebody being racist in a room. But actually, there's a whole range of things that people do. And some of them are very tiny. So some of them are things like, if you're in a meeting and someone says something that is problematic in whatever way, you may not say anything in that room because you're not the chair, you're junior, you can't, it's difficult. But what you might do is actually just look for a moment at someone, catch the eye of someone else in the room and know that they're seeing things in the same way that you are. So maybe you deal with it later. So all the way through to doing a direct challenge and then seeing that ripple effect into the interaction. And actually one of the most effective things that you can do when somebody is being problematic in lots of different ways is to just wait. Because actually people will quite often back off their own thing, or they'll do what we call self-repair. They'll sort of notice that people haven't immediately come back with it, and they'll inspect their own thing and say, oh, but I didn't mean X, or oh, but of course I didn't mean that other thing. So, and then again, every single time in conversation, you're deciding to say something or not say something, or not say something, and it's running past. The conversation is running really quickly. So it's one of the things that is really, I think, useful for people, and I quite often use these sorts of materials in workshops, is actually see these sequences unfold where someone said something, everyone in the room saying, oh my God, I can't believe they said that. And this is what I would do. And then you see how it actually unfolds. And sometimes there's quite a gap between what people imagine they would do and what actually happens.
What are the interesting insights that you've learned around silences and stuff in conversations? That's something that on the podcast I had to get used to very early on. That there was a famous clip, actually. I'm not sure whether you saw it, but you'd be fascinated. You can go back and watch it. Elon Musk went on Lex Fridman's podcast about 6 months ago, and a clip went around the internet and did about 1 million plays, and it was a 31-second pause after Lex asked a question and before Elon did. And after a while, it becomes comical. They just sat in silence. But Elon, he's asked, how long is it going to be until we get to Mars? And Elon sits and thinks and thinks and thinks and thinks. But that ability to sit with silence is something that new podcasters really struggle with. And generally people overall do. So why is silence so uncomfortable? And what are some of the interesting things that you've learned from studying silence in conversations?
So my field of conversation analysis has, right from the start, has sort of been, running for 50 years so the thousands and thousands and thousands of conversations in all settings you can imagine have been recorded, transcribed, and we use a very technical system to transcribe, which will, pinpoint exactly how long any silence, any gap or pause is, and turns those "hi, how are you, fine, how are you," you're looking at about 100 to 200 milliseconds. So that's quite a pace of interaction. One of the founders of the field said that a silence of 1.0, like a whole second is starting to be quite a delay. And you can even see that when, so as soon as you see a conversation where there's a 2-second delay or a 3-second delay, they're quite big delays. Now, of course, depending on whether you can see each other, you're co-present, or you're on the phone, or you're writing, which is different on something like, WhatsApp. But those silences can sometimes be clear about what they're doing. So silence isn't typically an inert thing. You can show someone that you're thinking,
like Elon did.
Yeah, but even so, there's a sort of there's a point in time where that just gets too long, and I would say 31 seconds or something is a massive outlier for interaction. So the longest silence that I have got in any of my data is police interview with a suspect. It's 11.2 seconds. The police have asked a question that's really difficult for the suspect to answer because almost anything is going to be incriminating. And in the end, after 11.2 seconds, the suspect says, "I really can't deal with that question, actually." And so they in the end, it doesn't work. And it's interesting that you mentioned this because just today, I was talking with a colleague about another really famous clip that you can go and look online, which was Charlie State interviewing Lady Gaga about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's something like he's asking her about Trump and she says she won't talk about it, and then there's this long silence, and it's very awkward to look at. And what's quite interesting is a year later, I happened to be doing a talk, and it happened to be that the event was sort of hosted by Charlie State, and he asked the same question about these silences. And then he told this little story that silence was actually 16 seconds long, and before they broadcast it, they cut it because it was so painful for viewers. They didn't want the viewers to have to sit through 16 seconds worth. So those long silences are a real breach, and I suppose the fact that we see them as, we can immediately pick up on that being a breach of the sort of normal, typical pace at which interaction occurs. We wouldn't see it as a breach if we didn't sort of tacitly know somehow, about a second is already getting quite long. So 6 is huge, and 11 is massive, and 31 is, that's a long, long, painful silence.
Why is it painful? What is it about the rhythm of conversation and the breaking of that rhythm that makes us feel like that nails on chalkboard thing?
I think it's I mean, I don't, the why is difficult, but what I can say is that what we see in interaction when we record it and transcribe it is simply that those lengths of delays don't happen. So they're not in our daily experience. So just as a basic thing, we're not used to regularly experiencing those length of delays because they just don't really happen. So it's like, what's going on immediately? This is really strange. It feels strange because it is strange. Quite simply, empirically, when you look at the data, it is just weird, and unusual. And the other thing is that we tend to want to fill silences as well. So we're constantly inspecting everything that everyone says to us as an analysis of what we did previously. So if I ask you a question and you don't answer for 31 seconds, you're starting to think, do I need to redesign the question? Was the question not clear? Because typically a silence, it will initiate what we call repair of some kind. So it might be that I ask you a question, there's a silence, and I immediately redesign the question. Or I issue an invitation and there's a silence, and so I immediately say, well, so a concrete example, you ask someone, do you want to come for dinner Friday? There's a silence. So we're so tuned into it that we immediately pick up that they're not going to respond within those sort of split seconds, and we say, or Saturday. So we're very attuned to how our interlocutors are responding to the actions that we are producing as they come out. And that's why, like, you're nodding as I'm saying these things. So I almost don't have to finish this, and where I'm going with this action, and that's how we're able to actually be so fast. And that, so we're preparing our responses, so that they're precision time within 10th of a second. How do we manage to do that? It's because of the sort of familiarity with a lot of actions that we're actually doing in our interactions, which makes anything a delay. And another one is saying I love you, that you've got to be like really rapidly coming back. Any kind of delay,
31-second delay on
does my bum look big in this? That has to be quick. 2 seconds is a problem.
Yeah, another thing that you see amongst, and this is me reflecting on me a long time ago, new podcasters especially, is that they'll ask a question and then they'll give the guest a menu of options that they can choose from. So, Liz, why did you get into studying conversational analysis? Was this something that you did as a kid, or was it? And to me, what I used to feel was sort of this visceral discomfort around asking a question and not having the confidence that the question was sufficiently interesting that I could just sit and just let the other person marinade in the question, because sometimes it's a difficult question. Sometimes it's maybe a question that they don't often think about or haven't heard before. But then by giving this sort of menu of options, I start to lead them toward, and it's a really dumb idea for podcasters to do, because what you're doing is you're offering, especially if it's an open question, you're offering the guest the opportunity to pick from every single potential question on the planet. And then if you give them 2 options, they have to either pick one or the other, say why it's not the first or the second one, or somehow break the convention that you've already constrained over them and go, well, actually it's neither. And very rarely will you ever hear someone say it's neither. Most of the time, the guest, unless they're super disagreeable, is just going to kind of take one of your suggested answers for them and then rework that into what they would have said in any case. But it's mostly, in my experience, it's mostly about the comfort of question, stop, silence.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you raise that, because you see that in particular settings where it's both surprising and really matters and is consequential. So if you've got a list of questions that you're going to ask somebody, in some settings, your list of questions is quite formal. It's a diagnostic instrument, for example, or it's a police interview, or it's somehow a regulated kind of conversation where there's guidance and some standard things. It's a standardized survey. You're meant to ask the same question in the same way over and over again. What researchers in my field show is that it's actually really difficult to, first of all, ask a question that is even an open, a WH kind of open-ended sort of question, or a yes/no kind of question, which again, a bit like, do you have Wi-Fi? That isn't a yes/no question. That requires a bit more. So open and, this idea of open and closed is a little bit of a myth, but just sticking to this idea that you can just, let's say, read out a list of questions without embellishing them, without going halfway through, without tweaking them slightly. And so people are very surprised when they see what they imagine is a standardized instrument, standardized experimental instructions in a laboratory, standardized police interview, whatever it might be. And then you just imagine that that's how they work. Then there is the law, there is a script, there is a list of questions. But it's remarkable how the reality of those interactions just doesn't look like that. And so you can imagine situations where this becomes really problematic. So if it's, for example, I've done some research on this with colleagues in Norway. We were looking at how teachers basically do oral communication assessments, and they're meant to ask a question, the same kinds of questions to all the pupils, but sometimes they do exactly what you say. They ask a multiple unit question, And then the pupil's like, well, which bit of that shall I address? Typically, you address the last bit first, and then you may or may not go back to the first bit. But it seems just quite difficult to just stick with this one question without doing a bit more work. It's the same in diagnoses. So, a psychiatric consultation, there's meant to be a standardized question. It'll get a bit of embellishment. Not for what reason? There's some interactional imperative that makes it very difficult to sound like a form. Even if you're a police officer in the situation where the law says, say it like this, it doesn't quite look like that.
What are ums and ahs and you knows used for?
Ums and ahs and you knows and okays, they're all different sorts of things. So they're not interchangeable in a conversation. Ums and ahs are quite often thought of as errors that you want to get rid of. So like that one now, they're very commonly littered through our talk, and it's quite difficult to totally erase them. But what they're doing is quite specific things. So sometimes they're doing, I'm thinking, I'm searching for a word. Sometimes they are showing difficulty in putting this thing together. They're showing an orientation to delicacy. So they're doing lots of different things in talk. People are critical of others who say and ah. But when you see a transcript, when people see a conversation analyst transcript for the first time, they're quite shocked at how messy it all looks. But that is how we talk. So yeah, but they're doing specific things. And I'll just say one thing about ums and ahs, which is maybe interesting. I talked a bit earlier about people phoning the vet. So I compared real pet owners telephoning the vet with mystery shoppers who don't really have a pet but are phoning up vet practices to report back on how good the service is. So, and these mystery shoppers, they have quite a lot of power in a way, because what they're doing is going back to the organisation to say how good people are at answering the phone. And so my question is, how good is a mystery shopper at passing as a pet owner? Because no one's done that research, so we're just taking it for granted that this mystery shopper can pass as a real pet owner. And the thing is, from a distance, they totally can. But when you start to look at lots of calls, you see how different they are. So a very gross difference is real pet owners typically phone up to make an appointment. A mystery shopper will phone to say how much is the cost of the service. And then when the receptionist tries to give them some help, like, do you want me to book you in, and sort of help you navigate calendars, the mystery shopper's like, oh, I might call back later, which is really weird. And you're thinking, what can they possibly report back to the organisation? They gave me a cost of something, that was it. But the ums and ahs are so interesting in these calls. So I'm going to totally make a mess of even saying this, but I'll try and get it right. So the mystery shopper will typically phone up and say, how much would it cost to get a dog vaccinated? A real caller will say, how much would it cost, if they were asking about cost? I've got a new puppy. How much would it cost to get my dog vaccinated? So they don't say a dog, they say my dog for a start. But the mystery shopper might say, how much would it cost for how much would it cost for a dog to be vaccinated? Whereas the real caller is more likely to say, how much would it cost for my dog to be vaccinated? So the ers are in different places. And what's that about? I mean, I don't know. I don't have enough data to really address the question. But what it shows us is that the ums and ahs aren't randomly splattered everywhere. They are, when you look at enough of them, they're doing particular bits of work in particular ways. And it's quite fascinating, if you're someone like me, to figure out what that's doing.
I read a blog post not long ago that was talking about the relative interpretation of people who either used silences or ums and filler words in between on whether they were seen as more or less intelligent. And I can't remember what the outcomes of that study were. Have you ever looked at this stuff?
I haven't seen that, but I can imagine that the outcome was that the people who say and ah are judged to be less intelligent, because that would be the stereotype. But
so I can't remember. I feel like it wasn't quite as simple as that. I feel like the results were more along the lines of what you do, which is pretty much everything's contextual. It's more to do with the flow of the conversation anyway, because somebody that's using silence is actually showing that they have confidence to be able to let that sit, and that they're maybe being more considered with what it is that they say. So I guess it's much more colourful. Speaking of filler words, why is everybody saying the word like?
I don't know. It's the one.
This is, come on, Elizabeth, this is you. This is right in the middle of your wheelhouse. Why are we cursed with this word?
I haven't studied it, but it is something that maybe I should start analysing. I mean, obviously people put it in place of say, or an action. So she was like, he was like, and it quite often comes before a quote, before reported speech. It can come before a reported action. So it's definitely doing some kind of preface to describing the words, conduct, behaviour of other people. I don't know why it's so common. It's a generational thing, but like lots of words, I definitely say stuff that my mum doesn't, and I say stuff that my students don't, and we things just sort of come in and out of common usage. And that's just language. Language is alive. It grows. It changes. One of my favourite things to do is have a look at if you just Google any word, it will give you a dictionary definition, but it'll also give you uses over time. So, for example, if you look at marvellous, marvellous, I don't know which way this is going to go on your screen, but marvellous has dropped off a lot in usage, but awesome has increased. And you can start to see the people who might be thinking, oh, we need to rescue marvellous. That's a great word, but then people are saying awesome, and that's hard to resist. So yeah, language changes all the time, and I think the important thing is to try not to put any kind of value judgment on this idea that saying like has something to do with that person's character, because again, as soon as you start to look at transcripts of people actually talking, politicians, everybody, you can show a lot of mess and repair, error, speech perturbations, ums and ahs and everything in pretty much anyone's conversation.
I saw a transcript that you'd done, I think, of Boris Johnson trying to give a pretty short speech, and it just looks like someone's thrown alphabeti spaghetti down on a piece of paper. It's not very slick at all. And you think this person has literally been elected to the highest position of power below the Queen in the United Kingdom, and he basically can't speak when you read it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there is some of that is just kind of standard and normal. Like I was saying, we're much messier, it seems, when you see it all written down and transcribed. But yeah, sometimes it can be interesting to really try to be precise about the mess, especially when, if someone's judged to be a great orator, for example, or they sort of pride themselves on speaking Latin and dropping that into an interaction and then show actually it's quite messy. Yeah, but there's only so much of some people's voices you can take in your ear, because you have to go over. It takes a long time to do the transcription. So yeah. Yes,
I bet. And I suppose some people kind of play into it, right? So I've got a friend, Rory Sutherland, who is kind of a big, gruff British man. He talks like this, and everything's a bit shit, isn't it? And the way that he speaks, I find incredibly charming. He'll sort of, and he'll add in these elements, but for him, it's part of, I find it completely part of the charm, that he'll pontificate with noise for a little bit and then deliver some amazing insight. And I think that goes back to what you were saying before about the fact that it's so contextual. The fact is that how is this person delivering it with everything else as well? And speaking of that, there's a common held belief that some huge percentage of our communication is nonverbal. Is that true?
So this is a great communication myth, very easily busted. So if you Google this, you'll see lots of examples of a pie chart, and the pie chart will tell you that communication is 93% nonverbal and 7% verbal. So if I now turned off the audio, this podcast would make sense still for 93% of the time. We immediately know that can't be true. But, it's very easy to sort of make that myth fall over. So, for example, if the podcast, you're just listening to it on audio, how come radio is so popular if 93% of communication is non-verbal? How do we ever speak in the dark? How do you have a conversation when someone's downstairs and you're calling up and down? So obviously this doesn't really make sense. If you go to another country and it's a different language, like if you go to France and you don't speak French, you should be able to get by 93% of the time. So it just doesn't really make any sense, but it's so compelling. And people do love a good statistic and a nice pie chart, and they feel like, wow, I've really learned this thing and it definitely makes sense. But one of the even nicer things about that particular communication myth is that the author of some of the original studies, Albert Morabian, himself has tried to bust the myth and sort of say how irritated he is by the sort of, he calls them something like self-styled communication consultant gurus who sort of stick this on pie charts, and it wasn't what he found, it was something else, it was more complicated, whatever. But I've been in lots of events, where people are talking about this stuff and they just trot it out, and again, almost always I just don't say anything, because it seems petty to say this is rubbish, but okay then, you just have to let it go. But it's clearly wrong. You only have to think about it for like 2 seconds to think, yeah, that can't be right.
Is body language stuff bollocks as well then? If I look up and to the right, if I cross my arms, if I start mirroring your posture and stuff like that, how much truthfulness is in that?
So obviously our bodies, our gestures, our gaze, and all of those things are all working in aggregate to get things done. So if somebody goes past in front of your camera and they might do that might mean, do you want a drink? And there's no words needed. We know what that means. But of course you can't just do that. Like, I can't do that to you now. And like, how are you going to get me that drink? It's not going to happen. So if you think about something like a request, depending on what you're asking for, who you're asking, your entitlement to ask for it, their obligation to fulfill the request, how important it all is, we will design our requests differently. And depending on the sort of the resources that we have to interact, we will deploy them as well. But of course, doing things with our bodies and our heads and our eyes is really important. And to give you one example of this totally silent, second-long interaction, it's coming back from Scotland on the train a few years ago, and I got on at Edinburgh, and the train was semi-empty then. I had a ticket, got on, got my seat, and then gradually, coming all the way back down to the East Midlands, it gets busier and busier and busier. Got rowdier. I think there'd been football, I'm not sure, but the train got really busy, really rowdy, very crowded. And a bunch of blokes got on. They were obviously quite drunk and don't know what their team had happened, but it was rowdy, and it had that sense of like, not sure where this is going. And obviously, for me sitting there, I'm just thinking, just read my book, don't make eye contact, just hope it'll all be fine. But there's a woman stood at the end of the carriage, so I'm sort of sat halfway down the carriage, and there's a woman at the end of the carriage, and we just look at each other for a split second, maybe a second, and in that moment we tell each other, we're seeing the situation, we'll just keep an eye on each other. And I don't know who she is, never saw her again, nothing happened, it was all okay. But in that moment, you're doing something, and that's just a look. But of course, how do you turn a look into a look? You have to we're even tacitly, we're not aware of it, but we're calibrating our gaze so carefully that we know what a look is, versus when we're talking and we're, looking to the right, lying, looking to the left, not like whatever it might be. But those things I think generally don't have much evidence behind them at all, because it's actually really difficult to assess that kind of look to the right, look to the left. Is this lying? Is this flirt? What are these things? Because they're almost never studied in natural settings, and that is the sort of the USP of my field. We look at real interaction where the stakes are real, whatever they are for people, in the wild, not simulated. We don't look at interaction in the laboratory. We don't ask people about their interactions. And that's very important to the kind of work that we do in conversation analysis.
I saw that a ton of psychological studies have just been put close to the chopping block. Power poses, nudging was in there as well. A bunch of stuff that was really, really struggling to replicate. And I think that one of the big questions that was being asked there was around the fact that, look, in a naturalistic setting, it's very, very difficult for us to get this. But okay, so how are you going to study it if it's outside of the laboratory? And is this, cultural conditioning masquerading as human nature? How do you separate out the cultural conditioning from something that's more inherent? I mean, it is an interesting one. I remember seeing this meme ages ago that was the look that you give old people when you walk past them on the street as a teenager to let them know that you're not a chav. And it was that face. It's not a smile. It's sort of down into the sides, sort of thinning of the lips and widening of the face without opening the mouth up. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about that meme. I must have seen it 2 years ago because it's completely true. I have no idea. There's no name for what that greeting emotion is. It's not a hello. It's actually something to do with like a I'm okay and you're okay. Maybe. I don't know. Do you know the thing that I mean? Do you know the dynamic I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm probably phoneticians could give the answer to this because they're very interested in somebody who studies the way speech is produced, including things like let's say the difference between going yeah and yep, and something about the closing of the yep. We all know when we've been yepped rather than yed. So I think there is something about a closed mouth smile. It's like the most neutral but friendly thing. I'm not going to open my mouth. I'm not going to do anything. I'm keeping my mouth closed. Yeah, I think that there is something in showing I'm doing nothing, if you like.
Yes, yeah, and very actually, passive.
Yeah, so I have a colleague, and she gets her students to, as a kind of experiment, go somewhere on campus and then do nothing. How do you do nothing in a way that doesn't attract attention? And of course, and you're not allowed to look at your phone. How do you do it? And it's how do you stand at the bar and do I am waiting to be served versus I'm at the bar, but I don't actually want to be served yet because I'm waiting for someone. And we have really, loads of ways of doing nothing in an innocent way. How do you do nothing in an innocent way on the street? Well, we could do it. So it's the same sort of thing. How do you show somebody that you're not threatening? And you've picked out that meme, and I think that's spot on.
What about dating and first date do's and don'ts? What are some of the biggest things that people should and shouldn't do?
I did do some research 10 or so years ago on speed dating. It's my one and only foray into it because I thought, oh God, I don't want to be the professor of dating, actually. And the thing that I was particularly interested in was this was before things like first dates on the television, which I've never seen. I keep thinking, I should go and look at those, but you never know what the raw data is like. So I was looking at people on speed dates. They were in a particular age bracket, 30 to 45, and it was, what seems to be the components of a date that runs smoothly. I didn't know what happened, into the future of their lives. And some of those things are, quite obvious, actually. Ask questions that aren't weird questions, that aren't too intrusive, that haven't been learned from a little book, about, ask them like, what's the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to you as your first question, because that would be a really interesting topic. Actually, you need to do those mundane things first and just sort of, just turn by turn feel your way into the interaction, and just that's what we're doing in conversation. We're constantly taking our cues from the other person. So it's a bit like being that vet receptionist, the one who notices this one doesn't want to talk about their dog versus this one definitely does. So all of those kinds of things are the same. I think having a topic, finding a topic that you can expand for more than 2 or 3 turns is important. I've just started to do some work on first dates on Messenger and WhatsApp, maybe the modern way to do it. So I'm looking at things like rapid message, silence. So you can see, and I've got these people from early dating all the way through to like the development of when they're an item and then a bit more, and you can see some painful stuff like message, all going smoothly, and then there'll be a delay, and then the first person is like, how long are they going to wait before they try again to restart the encounter? And I don't know, even just reading these things that I've never met the people, it's just text messages, but you sort of feel the pain of the person who's like, they haven't said anything, shall I try again? And eventually,
can't triple text. You can double text, but you can't triple text.
Is that right? I also had a PhD student a few years ago who screen recorded people doing Facebook Messenger chats, so we could see what they were writing before they sent it. And some of these conversations were hilarious because you'd see someone, the cursor would be blinking there on the screen, and they'd be typing XXX blinker, then delete, and then like maybe a sticky out tongue emoji, delete, and then like what do they end up sending? And I'm thinking, what would that look like in a real conversation if it was face to face? That would be quite a strange kind of like, are we going for like cheek? What are we doing in this way? We're greeting each other or signing off. But what you see in her particular work is the same kinds of things that you see in spoken interaction. It's just that you can't hide the fact that you are starting it one way and then deleting it and doing something else. Whereas in fact, our conversation is full of things like from the dating stuff that I looked at, there's these moments that always happen, which is about whether or not the person's been married before. So this is this demographic 30 to 45. And so one of the things that always comes up, either because people disclose it tacitly, like saying things like, I was divorced or I've got kids, so they give away some of their relationship history. But if they don't, then it becomes a bit of an elephant, like okay, am I going to ask you what your relationship history is? How am I going to figure this out? And what I found was that women want, in these dates, this is 10 years ago, a particular cohort, women ask men, so what's your relationship history then? They want to know, and men are accountable if they can't say at age whatever, 40, that they've had some kind of commitment in the past. Whereas I have to say, in my small data set, it didn't matter the other way around. So men didn't ask the question, and they didn't, they weren't bothered if a woman hadn't had that kind of demonstrable commitment previously. But I've got this one case where the woman is saying, so if you've got you've got any kids? Like I probably can't say that you've got no kids on the basis of everything you've told me so far, which sounds very sad. And you see these little corrections as the question comes out. So if you were writing them down, it would look like, so no kids then, delete. Got any kids?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I suppose that
you wouldn't see the presumption, and then, I suppose I should ask you this, even though I definitely know by now. I can tell, whatever.
When you're studying chats, you're only studying what people ended up pressing send on. But the number of times that you go back and forth, and then you have to think that there's one layer further up from that, which you need to actually speak to our mate Elon about to get Neuralink, which is, what were the things that arose in consciousness but didn't make it to your thumbs?
Yeah, right.
Because there's a bunch of things that you could have said that this no, that no, still no, I wrote it, but no, and then this is the one that I end up pressing send on. Yeah.
Which, when you think about it, how on earth we actually do have these rapid conversations that are moving at such a pace, it's quite amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know, what's going on upstream, because my field is dedicated to what some colleagues have called the rich surface of interaction. So I don't know what's going on under your school. You don't know what's going on under my school. We've only got what each other says and does as evidence of anything. So that's where conversation analysis focuses, which is different. I'm a psychologist by background, but I'm not interested. I mean, I am interested as an ordinary human being, but I don't try to ascribe what someone really thought or whether they really are this thing, because what I'm looking at is how people are attending to, am I coming off this way or not? Or I didn't want to come off this way. I need to attend to the way I'm coming across. Or if people say things like, I don't know, is that I'm not interested in whether they really know or not, somewhere in their brain, and how you'll get to that. It's more like, why is someone saying I don't know at this point? Is it actually to try and avoid answering the question? Is it to account for not being able to answer a question? What is that doing right now? Because when you look at these words and how they're placed in sequences like this, it's quite hard to just track them all back to some sense of what's going on cognitively, because you can see that people are doing things that it's not just about my brain to your brain. It's also about, how am I coming across and fixing this? And am I saying things that make sense? Do I need to keep tweaking and keep kind of turning the spanner a little bit until I've got the thing, and we have shared understanding of this thing that we're both doing together in this interaction?
Also, there's certain people whose personalities don't lend themselves to taking that feedback particularly well, or at all. And everyone's got that friend that just continues to bloviate, and they're just plugging away. And sometimes they're useful. If you're out on a night out or whatever, and you just want someone, it's like background, it's wittering, it's just the birds outside. You go, there goes Bruce. He's just continuing to churn on and on and on. And then you have other people who are overly receptive, right, to the awkwardness, to potential silences, to whatever. You studied, am I right in thinking that you looked at hostage negotiations and suicide hotlines and stuff like that as well? What do you learn from that?
Well, first of all, it's an amazing job that the crisis negotiators do. So I looked particularly at suicide crisis negotiation. So these are the recordings. So I was given access to the recordings by the police negotiators, who record at the scene as part of the job. So again, the data are kind of already there. They're like found materials because they're recorded I'm not sure if anyone really ever looks at them again, but this was the job. And the first time you start to listen to these recordings, very typically it's someone who's on a roof threatening to jump or threatening to asphyxiate themselves, do some serious harm to themselves. And obviously, it's the most difficult data that I've ever analysed. And you also feel a real sense of responsibility, because at the end of the research, I'm going to go back to the negotiators and tell them what I found, and not do training, because I don't like to think of it quite as training. But basically, what I'm doing is showing them what they're doing that really is effective, and showing them the things, or hoping that they will see from the clips that I will then choose to sort of play anonymized and play out for them, hoping that they will come to the conclusion that isn't an effective strategy. But mostly it's about your colleague who is amazing at their job or is very experienced. What is it that they're actually doing? Because one of the things that I, as a total novice into this environment, hadn't realized at the start was that a lot of these negotiations have a successful outcome in that the person comes down safely. So I went into it thinking, I had no idea what the statistics were.
You would be listening to a ton of people's last rites, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And that isn't how it is. So then what I'm interested in is, okay, along this 2-hour, 4-hour, 9-hour negotiation, what are the turning points, so that we can think about what are the negotiators doing to get that person to, let's say, a more physically safe space on the roof, so that they can really push the negotiation. So a lot of the first part is, how do we get someone from a very precarious situation where they might fall, even if they now don't intend to commit suicide, to somewhere much more physically stable, so that we can then really start to, support them, encourage them, and so on. So that was that. And a couple of things that I found that were very interesting, me and my colleague, Ryan Sickfeland, we looked at basic requests for dialogue. So any negotiation requires people to take turns in conversation. That's what it is. It's nothing else. You don't know anything about the person typically, so you've got no background about that. You might think you're interested in a psychologist, like you don't know about their suicidal ideation, you don't know about their intent, you don't know anything about them, they're a stranger. So you can't sort of assess their background and then on the basis of that develop a strategy. Your strategy has to evolve on the basis of the evidence of everything that they say. So what you want is to think, right, everything they say is staying alive. So every time the person says something, they're choosing to stay alive and not jump. So that's good. So how do we keep them taking turns? But also, how do we keep them taking turns that are positive rather than negative? And that's what we were after. And so one of the first jobs is, the negotiator arrives on the scene, you have to expect resistance. Because if you do something so strong in a way, or such a strong stance that you're on a roof and you're going to jump, it's not the case that the negotiator comes and says, really want you to come down, buddy. Oh, okay then. Because people are in that situation are, again, surprisingly logical, very clued into how rational they appear. So they're not going to just change their mind like that. There has to be a negotiation. It's going to take time. It has to. Otherwise, people don't look, if you take a stance, you don't just change your mind. People want to be seen as consistent. So you see that. So how do you get someone talking? And one of the very first things we found was that negotiators will typically say, can we talk about how you are? And in this one nice example that I've got, the negotiator says, can we talk about how you are? And when you just show that line, I then show that the next line is 0.7 seconds. So you think, okay, that's not going to start talking. You're going to see resistance. And people think that they're going to say, I don't want to talk about how I am. They focus on, they're not going to want to talk about how they are to this stranger. But in fact, what happens next is that the person in crisis says, no, I don't want to talk. So they don't attend to the how you are. They're just like, I don't want to talk this thing, this particular thing that you've asked me to do. And then they put the phone down in this case. So that's the, but now the negotiator's got to try again. So you just see these little natural experiments in which the negotiator can't give up. They've got to try again. And in the trying again, you see, well, what is it that's working? And what we found was that dialogue proposals that are built from the verb to talk get resistance. They get resistance like, what's the point in talking? Talking doesn't do anything. And they actually orient to this notion that talking doesn't really do things. Whereas when negotiators say something like, I want to speak to you and let's sort things out. So speak gets traction. It doesn't get resistance. People don't say things like, actions speak louder than speak. We don't have that in our idiom. We don't have the same sense that speaking doesn't do anything, and you can, walk
Talk
the
is
walk,
cheap.
and speak the
Speak
speak.
is
Yeah,
cheap.
exactly. We don't say it that same way, and so we found, and this was generally my field is thought of as qualitative research, where you look at, in a lot of detail at a small number of cases. But because we were so surprised by this, we went through and coded all the data, did some statistical analysis as well, and basically found that speak gets far less resistance and faster traction than asking to talk. And I suppose the nice coda to all of this is that we then went back and showed this to the negotiators in the UK, and they were able to sort of start it faster. It's also nice to show people things that is already part of somebody else's natural practice. We're not telling them to do something that's weird or not part of anybody's or experience and what they are just kind of doing naturally somehow. But it also shows you that verbs make a difference. So back to the point earlier about being pushed and pulled around by language, we're not really aware. We also typically think that this person's going to do it or not. It doesn't matter what words you say. But frankly, if you don't look at the actual encounters, you can't say that. You can't say that words don't make a difference if you're not prepared to actually study those words in those real situations. And so that's what we found.
Didn't you have another example about bathroom towels in hotels?
Yeah, that was me thinking about this idea of nudge, because of course, it's a very, it's a pop psych kind of behavioral science kind of concept. It's not my type of thing. It's not my type of work. But I think it is interesting that in this particular study, I can't remember the authors now, but it was basically, people recycle more with the wording of the sign in one direction rather than another. I can't remember what that is now even. But really my point was, let's look at the language much more than the sort of overall message that it's pushing towards. So one of them was about, I think it was something like, please recycle your towels, versus something like, 55% of people who stayed in this room, your room, recycled. And it was something like that, the more personalized message, drawing on social norms. And there's all sorts of theory you can put around that. But for me, what I'd be interested in is looking at the way we are pushed and pulled around by language in a not malevolent way. Sometimes it is malevolent, but actually words make a difference. So asking someone to speak rather than talk is doing something. It's sort of tilting the outcome in some way. I've also shown that if you ask someone if they're willing to do something that they previously resisted doing a bit, then they're more likely to say yes than if you ask them if they're interested in doing it or if they would like to do it. There's a bit of a caveat here, which is that willing is quite a heavy thing to ask someone if they're willing to do it. So you don't say to your partner, would you be willing to put the bins out? Because it kind of implies, well, what do you mean willing? Like that's quite heavy. But actually willing gets these turnarounds in ways that other verbs don't get. So you can start to see that words in turns make a difference to the very next thing that happens. And so I mean that isn't the kind of thing that nudge behavioral scientists typically look at, but I think it's very interesting, the sort of natural way in which we are, shaped by language all the time. So going back to those how are yous and this recording of a conversation where it's two women on the phone and they go, Debbie, Shelley, what do you what's going on? And you can see that they're just immediately they're finding it impossible to resist the conflict straight away. How do you not do that? It's very hard to immediately not engage in the frame that someone has set up. So as soon as you accept that, you realize, God, we how do you not get involved in that argument? How do you resist that, whatever it might be? Yeah.
I've got a friend, Alex Hormozy, and he did a video not long ago talking about how he always convinces his missus to go to Cheesecake Factory. And he frames the question in the same way that he used to do it on sales calls. And instead of asking if she wants to go to Cheesecake Factory or saying that he wants to go, he says, would you be opposed to going to Cheesecake Factory? And obviously, well, I'm not opposed to going to Cheesecake Factory. Yeah. I'd just rather go somewhere else. But that's pretty effortful in terms of a response to go to. And if you've already got, well, I I would like to go to Cheesecake Factory and you are not opposed. Therefore, if I have a preference and you have no preference, well, no, I do have a preference. I just haven't had my turn to say it yet. And that was really interesting. Another person, I've had Chris Voss on the show, who you may be familiar with, the ex-head negotiator of the FBI's anti-terrorism unit. And he has this really cool idea around getting a "that's right" from hostages. From hostage takers. Hostages can't say anything. And he was telling this story about he was coaching one of his guys through a very long hostage negotiation that was happening maybe in the Philippines or in Vietnam or something like that a decade ago. And this guy had had these people for ages, and they knew that the statistics suggest that if it gets past a particular amount of time that people start being shot, this is not good. And they were just not getting anywhere. And Chris said to his understudy, you need to get a "that's right" from him today. And the "that's right" is about steel manning the other person's position. It's about showing them that you understand precisely why they feel the way that they do. So this guy went through a huge, big, long spiel of, I understand that you feel like these imperial colonialist powers have come back and they've taken your country's sovereignty and that you're holding these tourists. I know that you feel this and I know that that's, and da-da-da-da-da. This big sort of long, very sort of protracted diatribe about how this is how you feel and blah, 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 blah. Is that right? And he got a "that's right" from him. And then within 24 hours, this guy had released all of the different hostages, but he fled. So they never ended up catching this dude. And then apparently about a month later, the hostage negotiator, Chris's understudy, received a phone call from a completely anonymous number. And he said, I just wanted to let you know that if you hadn't spoken to me that day, every single one of those hostages would have been killed. I'm not sure what you did, but your bosses need to be very thankful for you for having done it. However, if I ever see you on the street, I'm going to kill you in cold blood. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah. It's such an intense story. But the idea around somebody that maybe feels mistreated, misunderstood, maligned, whatever it might be, showing them that you appreciate the position that they're coming from, it seems to be a powerful tool.
Yeah, I suppose we call it empathy, and it's really hard to get right because, of course, the risk of telling people or saying, blah, 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 is that right? If you don't get it right and you're...
no, idiot, everyone's dead now.
Exactly. So this is why, you have to really... What I've seen in those suicide negotiations is that there is a point where the negotiator has sort of built up, or at least they sort of show this by what they do. They've built up enough evidence, data from what's been said so far to be able to do that kind of thing at the right point in time, and how much they misfire if they come too early. And no, that's not how I feel. And then you're just sort of down the spiral. So yeah. The other thing that I particularly noticed in the negotiations, but I've seen this in other situations as well, any place where people start from quite different stances. So, do you want to do this thing? I don't want to do this thing, or I didn't even ask you to ask me about this thing. So, a sales call is another example, but a crisis negotiation is another. And anybody who's you're trying to get someone to do the thing that they've actively resisted. And it's about claiming independence. So again, the negotiators that were really effective weren't doing things like, I really care about you, I really understand, because you can almost write the script. It's like, well, you don't know me, you don't care about me, you don't know me, you can't say these things. Whereas the negotiators that were getting the outcomes sort of more swiftly with less friction were saying things like, how did you get up there? Because if you say, how did you get up there, it's a question that is, answering it doesn't require any kind of compromise because the person already decided to do that. So they're talking about things that they have already decided to do. And so the sort of interactional foundations of the person coming down and that safe outcome is switching from, if you like, textbook showing care and empathy and help and sort of more softly to actually moving towards something that is a bit more direct, like speak. It doesn't sound as friendly as talk, but it's actually what happens better. We also see that if they offer to help, that gets resistance, like you can't help me. Whereas if they say something like, let's see, we can sort things out, that gets more traction because it's about action. It's not about the soft things that you might imagine are working. And then eventually what you see is, again, get the person in crisis to start talking about things they already decided to do today, and get them talking about them deciding to do things. And that seems to be the start of the successful outcome of the interaction.
Chris has another one where he says that a lot of the time in relationships, if you feel like there's something that's off with your partner, people's go-to is, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And his advice, a better approach he suggests, is to say, it seems like there's something on your mind. And that, again, is... It's so interesting, your work. I mean, you must find it incredibly fascinating because it's at the intersection of a bunch of different things. It's not just linguistics. It's not just what the words mean. It's culturally, how is this word in the milieu beyond the definition of the word? Then how's it been delivered? Then how long's the wait been? Then what's the particular stage of relationship that you have between what you coming in with your priors? What are the expectations? Yeah, I mean, it's a very multifaceted thing. And then to take that down and put it onto a piece of paper and then to reverse engineer that back around, it seems pretty complex. It seems like an incredibly complex science, art form.
I mean, it is complicated, but in a way it's what I'm doing is explaining and showing people things that people are often because I'm working not just on dating, but the more sort of serious and institutional kinds of environments that I've mentioned, showing people things that they're not aware that they're doing, and how sometimes they're doing it incredibly well, and sometimes people like them, are doing this thing not so well at all. And it's a bit like proofreading, you can't proofread yourself, but as soon as you give it to somebody else and look over their shoulder, you can see all the errors. And so it is complex, but it's not like there's a huge conceptual gap between what I'm doing and the phenomenon. It's not like I'm studying black holes where they don't exist for people to understand them. Whereas language communication exists for people to live life and get everything done. And sometimes it can be a challenge because we've all got our lifetime's experience and anecdata of how we talk. But what I do know as a conversation analyst is that how we think we talk isn't quite how we talk. And sometimes the things that we think are effective aren't quite right, or we can get a sense that conversation didn't go very well, but I can show you how, exactly where. And then the challenge is to show that it's not just a one-off, it's a systematic thing, that people tend to do it this way, and it tends to immediately derail, create a friction, create something you've got to fix. And you might get back on track, but you might not at the end of that conversation.
Have you looked at how easy it is for people to change their patterns, the speech patterns and the sort of words that they use and things like that?
So I do a lot of training with the research findings. So some of those findings are easier for people to see their way to doing than others. So talk and speak and help and sort, those words that negotiators use typically at the start, can be changed, if you like. People can start with, I want to speak to you and get things sorted out, rather than I'm just here to talk and try to help. And you can change that fairly easily, simply because they typically happen at the start of the encounter, where it is the negotiator doing the talking.
Heavily scripted.
And you haven't got into the kind of back forth at this point. So there is that on the one hand. Then there are other things that are easier for people to change when they are, let's say, delivering a package of information that you can see works really well or doesn't go down so well. So one of the very first things that I did when I was sort of going from, this is interesting from a research point of view, to maybe the people who I'm studying would also find this useful, was looking at mediators, so people who are trying to help conflict without the courts involved. How do they have that initial conversation with people who might become their client at the end of this conversation, yes or no? How do they describe what mediation is? Because hardly anyone's heard of it. They typically phone a mediation service because they've got a problem. They've got a neighbour dispute or a workplace dispute, but they don't really want to ever see this person again. In fact, what they're phoning for is, they start things like, I've just phoned a lawyer and they've given me your number, or I've just phoned the police and they've put me onto you, or I've just phoned the council. And so this person wants their neighbour evicted, arrested, whatever. So then a mediator is going to explain mediation, which is, we're going to get you together in a room and it's all going to be fine. It's not a very easy sales pitch. But at some point in this conversation, there's going to be a moment where the mediator will have heard the problem and then say something like, so let me tell you a bit about mediation. And then they deliver a package of information about what mediation is. And at this point, you see the outcome start to split. So these are the things that you can train people to do, because no one's born knowing how to explain mediation. And what I found was that if you explain it as a sort of ethos, a philosophy, we're impartial, we don't take someone's side, we don't judge, people are quite turned off by that. But if you explain there's a process, this happens and then this happens and this happens, then people are more bought into the idea that things are going to change because you've laid out a process, and I can see myself slotting into that process. So those are the kinds of things that you can change, because you just train your staff to explain what it is your organization does in a different way. I suppose I would just say, though, that everything that I learn that is effective is based in what someone is doing. And a lot of people aren't doing it. And whether or not you can really train people to change their words in a moment by moment way, I'm not really sure. At the end of the day, you need to be as good as that vet receptionist who can hear, this person wants to talk about their pet, I'll go with that because that's going to get me where I want to go, which is get the client. Whereas this one, they just want the information, so I'll give them the information, and then they might become the client that way. And it's being able to do that. And so we have to ask ourselves, can I do that? Can I tell the difference between the one who wants to talk about the dog and the one who doesn't? Not everyone can.
Elizabeth Stokoe, ladies and gentlemen, if people want to check out more of the stuff that you do online and follow you, where should they go? Twitter, probably. I'm at Liz Stokoe on Twitter. Amazing. Liz, I appreciate you. Thank you. What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.